Story 1. Frozen Fortitude. How Vikings slept through Nordic winter. You close your eyes and drift backward through time, not to the great battles of the Viking Age, not to the longships slicing through fog or the raids that shook distant shores. No, tonight we begin in a quieter place, a longhouse, somewhere deep in rural Norway. It is the year 873 AD outside. The snow has stacked so high it smothers the hills. Inside, a smoky warmth hums from a hearth lined with old stones, their edges rounded by decades of fire. This is where the real Viking endurance happened. Not at sea, but here, in the slow stretch of winter when survival was a matter of sleep, soup, and steady routines. You're not standing in a palace. You're in a timber-framed structure, planks fitted roughly together, insulated with turf and dung. The roof is low, darkened beams curve upward like a whale's ribcage. It smells of smoke, sheep fat, and old wool. A thick fog of warmth clings to the air just above your head. Your breath still steams, but only faintly now. Most of the family is already asleep. They don't sleep on beds, exactly, but raised wooden platforms lined with straw, furs, and old woven blankets. There are no pillows as you'd know them, only folded cloaks or bundled tunics. They sleep in their clothes because changing them would be too cold, too wasteful. The outer garments, woolen caftans, reindeer hide boots, double as bedding. Every item had to serve more than one purpose. The fire in the center of the room is never allowed to die, even at night. Someone is assigned to keep it glowing, usually the eldest son or a visiting thrall. Embers are buried in ash to smolder softly, preserving their heat until morning. It is not just for comfort. The fire keeps the house dry, keeps the frost from creeping in, and wards off spirits, both real and imagined. As you listen to the occasional pop of wood, you'll notice the design of the house wasn't accidental. Longhouses were long for a reason. Family animals and storage all existed under one roof, sometimes separated by only a half wall of woven branches. You might hear the low breath of oxen or the occasional rustle of chickens shifting in there. Sleep. Vikings didn't sleep in silence. They slept to the sound of breathing, creaking beams, dripping meltwater, and wind slamming gently against turf walls. And they weren't truly isolated. Winters were a time of forced togetherness, when storytelling, knitting, carving, and gossip drifted long into the dark hours. Dreams began with stories, usually sagas passed down by voice, some half-remembered, others carefully memorized. The sagas weren't all about warriors. Some told of lost cows, wandering spirits, or women who could speak with wolves. These tales gave structure to the long night, and because there was no real bedtime, the end of a story often signaled the beginning of sleep. Someone might nod off mid-sentence. Another might finish the tale softly while folding wool or mending leather. No candles flicker here. Candles were rare, costly, and saved for religious use. Instead, oil lamps carved from stone or clay burned. Fish oil or tallow, with wicks made from moss or twisted linen. The light was dim, yellow, and slow, just enough to find your boots if needed. Hygge, a word we often hear in modern Scandinavian culture, might have its roots in this, though the Vikings wouldn't have used the term. But the idea was the same: warmth, closeness, rhythm. They didn't fight the dark. They yielded to it. They made sleep not a retreat, but a shared ritual. There's a smell coming from the far wall: preserved cod, hung in strips to dry and soften. You wouldn't eat it cold, it would break your teeth, but soaked in broth with roots and a pinch of salt, it would keep your belly full through the harshest winds. That soup is already bubbling in a blackened pot, to be eaten at dawn or, perhaps, earlier if someone wakes too cold to wait. What's often forgotten is how much the Vikings prepared for this time of year. Summer was not a season of leisure. Every day it was used to gather fuel, dry meat, collect berries, patch roofs, and mend boots. Every stitch had meaning in winter. Every repaired cloak could mean one more warm night. And not every Viking lived in grand longhouses. Some slept in huts, burrows, or even converted boats turned upside down. In Iceland, early settlers built homes into the earth itself, using turf like bricks. These structures were not elegant, but they were warm, sometimes warmer than wood-built homes, thanks to natural insulation and the absence of wind gaps. You might wonder now, how long were these nights? Truly, In northern Scandinavia, the sun might not rise for weeks. The body's rhythms became strange. Without clocks, time was measured by habit, hunger, and heat. People slept into shifts, sometimes called first sleep and second sleep, in between. They might pray, stoke the fire, whisper with their spouse, or simply stare into the glow of embers. Imagine that, waking in the middle of the night, not in panic, but in peace, expecting it, honoring it. The in-between became its own kind of stillness, one that modern science now recognizes as natural to humans. And what of dreams? We don't have Viking dream diaries, but we have fragments of poetry kennings and metaphors that hint at the deep connection between sleep and memory, between cold nights and the inner world of myth. Odin himself, the All-Father, is said to have sacrificed an eye for wisdom and wandered between sleep and wakefulness in pursuit of knowledge. Could it be that even the gods, in the long Nordic winters, dreamed not of war but of warm fires, quiet breath, and stories half finished? And speaking of stories half finished, what might the second sleep have looked like when the fire burned low and the wolves howled outside? So, you've stirred awake in the middle of a Viking night. The fire is a soft glow now, just embers tucked into their ash bed. The air has cooled again. You can see your breath. Around you, nothing stirs, but not because everyone is sleeping. This was known as the in-between, the space between first sleep and second sleep, a time neither fully night nor morning. Historians call it segmented sleep, a pattern common in pre-industrial societies. For the Norse, it wasn't unusual, it was expected. They didn't rise in alarm or confusion. Waking between sleeps was seen as natural, even useful. You might sip broth, you might think, you might pray to your gods, or simply listen. If you were lucky, an elder might whisper a verse from the Edda, or begin carving a story into wood. These moments were quiet not just because the house was asleep, but because the land was. The wind died, the animals settled, snowflakes clung to the turf roof in silence. You didn't need to speak much. Time wasn't rushing. There was no sunrise on the horizon, yet just a long pause in the middle of sleep's slow song. You might hear someone softly mumble a charm or rune. Some Viking-age people believed the cold hours between sleeps were when magic crept closest, when one could whisper hopes to the spirits, or hear forgotten ancestors in the crackling of firewood. For farmers, this middle period became useful. They might check on calves, shift straw, tend to boots left near the fire to dry. Even in these frozen weeks, life pressed forward. Grain stores needed turning. Roots needed checking. If frost crept in, it meant loss not just of food, but of days ahead. And yet, even with these duties, there was a gentleness to it. You weren't expected to do much. These were not hours of labor, but of maintenance, a stillness with purpose. In larger households, a mother might use this time to teach her daughter how to mend wool with bone needles, her breath fogging over the cloth. A grandfather might recite a tale half dreamed, half remembered. When the chores were done or the fire tended, people returned to sleep not out of exhaustion, but because the body followed its own rhythm. Sleep came in waves, and you followed it without question. It wasn't until modern lighting disrupted this cycle that segmented sleep faded from memory. But the Vikings, without clocks or gas lamps, lived by darkness. Their sleep patterns were shaped by what the world allowed, not what it demanded. Let's return now to the structure around you. The longhouse walls were insulated not by luxury, but by necessity. Earth, straw, turf, even woolen scraps were packed into the crevices. Windows were almost non-existent, just tiny vents tucked high near the roof for smoke to escape. Even those were stopped with cloth or wood when it got too cold. You might wonder, how did they keep warm? The answer lies in layers, not just of fabric, but of community. Vikings didn't sleep far apart. Whole families nestled together on shared platforms, children between parents, elders closer to the fire. Body heat was part of the architecture, and there was no shame in huddling close. Wool cloaks were passed down for generations, thickened with lanolin and mended again and again. Some wore fur-lined tunics or wrapped their feet in dried grass inside leather shoes. Soapstone bed warmers heated on the fire were placed under fur blankets to radiate warmth. And sometimes when it was coldest, they sang, not loudly, not for performance, Just humming a low drone, a half-tune passed from mouth to soothe a baby, or to calm a restless mind. The melodies weren't preserved in written form, but the sagas hint at lullaby songs about ships returning, about wolves curled in snowdrifts, about gods that slept beneath mountains. These lullabies, it's believed, helped regulate breath, slow the heart, and ward off fear, because the coldest part of the night wasn't just cold, it was long, too long for comfort, too long for easy dreams, and so they sang, gently, quietly, into the dark. By now, your breath has slowed with theirs. The fire is warm again, tended by someone who's already settled back into second sleep. You feel the weight of the furs. You hear the hush of winter pressing against the doorframe. You might even forget the year. This, in many ways, was Viking resilience, not strength in battle, but the patient survival of long, frozen nights. And while you rest, it's worth reflecting on what winter meant for their minds. With little light, few visitors, and no written books for most, thoughts turned inward. Memory became entertainment. Repetition became art. A story told 20 times might gain a new twist each night. Sometimes winter was when sagas were born, not in halls of kings, but in these dim, quiet hours between sleeps. A grandfather would add a metaphor. A mother would remember a different ending. A child would ask a question, and the whole tale would shift shape. And through it all, the world outside stayed frozen. The snow climbed higher. The moon sometimes disappeared behind clouds for days. But inside, the world remained alive, not bustling but breathing. You might ask, did they fear the cold? Of course, frostbite, hunger, collapse, all real dangers. But the Viking worldview didn't treat winter as a villain. It was a test, one you pass not with speed or weapons, but with preparation, steadiness, and silence. In the sagas, winter is rarely described in detail. It is accepted, endured, named, and moved through. It is the unspoken background, the canvas on which the rest of life is painted, the challenge that made strength meaningful, and it shaped them. By the time spring returned slowly, with dripping snow and damp wood, the Vikings had emerged not just alive, but ready. Their survival wasn't just bodily, but cultural. These nights shaped their language, their patience, their memory, their trust in fire and family and stories. So what of second sleep? What dreams came after the hush? Were they darker, deeper? Did they linger longer in memory? Or were they gentler, cradled in warmth, softened by the sound of chickens shifting and neighbors breathing? Did the sagas we know now begin as whispers in that second sleep you wake, not to the sound of alarm, but to the slow shifting of life? The longhouse is still dim, but there's a subtle change, maybe the tone of birdsong, maybe the rhythm of the fire crackling louder. The second sleep is over. The Viking world is stirring again. Morning isn't a sudden event in the Norse winter, it's a slow unfolding. A soft glow leaks through a narrow opening in the roof, not sunlight exactly, but daylight's quiet cousin. Outside, the snow remains deep and stubborn, yet it's different now, crusted over, more reflective. You can sense in the creak of the beams and the sigh of the family dog that winter's grip is loosening. But before anyone steps outside, there's breakfast to prepare. Not a lavish meal, no Viking household had feasts every day. Instead, it's a warm bowl of barley porridge or leftover stew from the night before, thick with root vegetables, salted fish, or bits of preserved lamb. Every bite counts. Calories are survival. There's no rush. Morning is ritual. The hearth is stirred, new wood placed carefully. The youngest child carries a scoop of snow inside and melts it in a clay pot for water. Someone adds fish oil to the fire lamp. A mother braids her daughter's hair, then wraps it under a woolen cap. The braids themselves are practical, kept tight to avoid lice, neat enough to show readiness for chores or, later in life, marriage. Chores begin always the same rhythm. Milk the goats, check the roof for damage, shake out the blankets, sweep the floor with a straw broom. Nothing heroic, nothing loud. But it is this that kept the Viking homestead alive through a winter that could last half the year. And it's not just physical survival we're talking about here, it's cultural. The stories, customs, crafts, and languages that define Norse identity weren't preserved by warriors, they were kept alive by families who made it through the winter over and over. With furs and fire and routine, outside, the snow begins to drip, Tiny drops fall from the turf roof onto logs stacked near the wall. Each drip is a promise. The thaw is coming. You might think this is the end of the story. But in fact, this is where Viking winter wisdom truly shines. Because they didn't waste the dark months. Winter was their planning season. While fields lay fallow, minds were active. Men carved handles for axes. Women spun wool for trade. Some began to map out sea voyages or repair sails. Others etched runes, not just for writing but for magic, for protection, for remembrance. They were preparing not just to live, but to live well when spring allowed. It's worth pausing here to remember. This was a people with no central government, no supermarkets, no thermostats. Every choice had meaning. Do you burn the last of your firewood in one night for comfort? Or spread it thin across 10 days? Do you save your thickest fur for sleep? Or for your journey to the thing, the Viking legal assembly? When the snow begins to melt, the wisdom wasn't written down. It was passed through habit, tone, gesture. A quiet nod that meant stir the soup now. A glance toward the ceiling that meant storms coming. They didn't write survival guides, they lived them. And if you think only the strong survived, think again. It was the observant, the patient, the ones who could sit still by the fire, listen to wood crackle, and measure time not by clocks, but by instincts. These were the people who carried the Norse way of life forward, across generations, across continents. So what happened when spring truly came? Melting snow revealed more than just mud. It exposed what had broken during the freeze. Tools lost in drifts, roof beams cracked by ice, sled runners that would need repair before they could carry goods to the nearest fjord. But it also brought relief, streams flowing again, daylight stretching longer, the scent of earth returning after months of nothing but smoke and sweat and cold. Children laughed more. Animals ventured farther from the longhouse. The family began clearing paths, preparing plots. Life picked up pace, but never all at once, and sleep changed. Gone were the segmented nights. As daylight stretched, so did the waking hours. Sleep came later, shorter, sometimes harder to reach after months of natural rhythm. But it didn't matter. Winter had done its job. The cycle continued. But perhaps what lingered longest wasn't the frost or the silence, but the stories told within them. Tales of the goddess Skadi, who ruled the mountains and snow, of Thor, whose hammer struck ice loose from boulders, of the Norns, the weavers of fate, who spun their threads even when the world seemed frozen in time, and of ordinary people, women who spun wool fast enough to clothe a whole household, boys who fetched firewood with frostbitten fingers, men who tracked a fox across miles of snow just to feed the baby with its meat. They didn't always make it into the sagas, but they were the reason the sagas could be told at all. So what do we take from this? That sometimes survival isn't about struggle, but about softness, about sharing space, about knowing when to speak, when to stir the fire, when to let sleep return, about preparing, with quiet care, for a season that doesn't forgive waste. And when the snow melts, when the first green shoots push through the thaw, the longhouse doors will open, not with fanfare, just with the creak of wood, the step of worn boots, and the beginning of another story. Because boring history, especially Viking winter history, is never truly boring. It's the foundation beneath the snow. Story 2, Wool and Patience, the secret economy of medieval monastic weaving. You find yourself inside a stone-walled room. It's quiet, not silent, but hushed in the way only monasteries can be. The year is 1272. The place, a Benedictine abbey in northern France. Dawn hasn't broken yet, but the loom room is already warm with motion. You might have thought monks spent most of their time in prayer, and you wouldn't be wrong, but here, tucked behind a cold cloister and a low arch, sits a space of rhythm and repetition, a weaving room, a cell of productivity. It smells of lanolin and dust and oiled wood. There are no markets here, no coins changing hands, but this quiet work, thread over thread, shuttle over shuttle, keeps the abbey alive, and, more than that, it keeps half of Europe clothed. You stand beside a monk with weathered hands. His name is Brother Gaudier. He's been at this loom for nearly 30 years. His posture is hunched. His eyes are clear. His fingers move automatically, tugging, guiding, nodding. He doesn't speak. There's no need. you notice the fabric. He's weaving is undyed, coarse, and stiff. This is not the fancy stuff meant for bishops or kings. This is wool for working friars, or perhaps for trade-heavy, reliable cloth destined for pilgrims, peasants, and the occasional merchant who stops by the abbey shop. Brother Gaudier doesn't set prices. That's not his concern. His concern is rhythm. Up, beat, slide, pull, beat down, repeat. The loom itself is large and fixed to the floor with pegs. It's made from ash wood, polished smooth where hands have touched it 1,000 times. You can hear the dull thunk of the treadle, the swish of the shuttle. It's not a noisy space, but it's far from lifeless. The sound is meditative, almost like breathing. You begin to understand. For monks, weaving isn't just labor, it's devotion. Each motion is a silent prayer. Each thread is a kind of offering. They don't weave for fashion or fame. They weave because the rule of Saint Benedict requires work, and because cloth must be made, and because order brings peace. Outside, frost coats the cloister stones. The bell for lauds won't ring for another hour. But inside, the loom room is already full. 5 brothers, seated or standing, moving wool as if the whole world depended on it. And in a small way, it does, because monastic weaving wasn't just a curiosity of religious life. In medieval Europe, abbeys were industrial hubs, quiet engines of rural economy. Long before factories or city guilds, monasteries produced cloth at scale. They had sheep, they had labor, and they had patience. The process began far from this. Loom, it started in spring, with shearing. The abbey's flocks, guarded by lay brothers or hired shepherds, would be rounded up, cleaned, and clipped. They were washed in large wooden vats with lye or stale urine, a detail modern imaginations might prefer to forget. The clean fleece was then dried, carded, and spun mostly by women in the surrounding village, working with spindle and distaff. Only then did it arrive here, in the sacred heart of the abbey, where monks like Gaudier would turn it into fabric, and not quickly. Wool weaving was a slow art. Even skilled monks might produce just a few yards in a day. Every warp thread had to be set, stretched, and weighted. Every weft pass had to be even. Errors weren't just inconvenient, they weakened the whole sheet, which is why Brother Gaudier has been working on the same bolt of cloth for over a week. It's almost done now. He pauses, runs his fingers along the edge, nods, and begins the finishing rows. You notice something unusual. He has added a small red stitch at the very edge, a single thread of dyed wool hidden near the selvage. This, it turns out, is a subtle marker, a quiet monastic habit, indicating which monk completed the cloth. Not for vanity, for quality control, for accountability. Because even among brothers, reputation mattered. Behind you, a younger monk enters carrying a basket of flax. They're experimenting with linen, here too lighter, harder to work with, more prized by upper clergy. The linen will be used for altar cloths, shirts, or handkerchiefs. But wool remains the backbone, not just because it's warm, but because it's reliable, repairable, washable, familiar. By the time the bell tolls, Brother Gaudier has finished. He sets the shuttle down with reverence, like setting down a candle. After Mass, he doesn't speak. He simply bows, presses his fingers to the wood, and walks out toward the chapel. You follow the sound of boots across stone. Later, in the refectory, the brothers will eat a small meal, mostly bread, lentils, or broth. There is little talk, only scripture read aloud from a wooden lectern. The speaker today is Brother Marius, who also happens to dye the wool when needed. He has blue fingernails today from woad. You realize. He reads a passage from Ecclesiastes, about a time to plant, a time to reap. You wonder how many winters has this abbey survived on thread and rhythm alone. And how many monks passed through these halls, never remembered by name, but present in every cloak, every curtain, every hem. The abbey doesn't keep portraits, it keeps textiles. And in those fibers threaded by dim light, over creaking looms, during hours no one counted, there lives the quiet pulse of a world sustained by patience. What kinds of knowledge were woven into those threads, and what stories might a single monk's bolt of wool have carried beyond the abbey walls, across roads, into markets, or even into war? The loom falls quiet, but the story of monastic cloth does not. You step outside the weaving chamber. Where morning has unfurled fully now, the cloister is bright with chilled air and filtered light. A low chant drifts from the chapel. The monks have begun their prayers. But you're following someone else this time, not Brother Gaudier, but a lay brother named Amo. His habit is simpler. His face is red from the cold, and in his arms, he's carrying fleece. This is the next layer of the abbey's economy. The sheep, without them, there is no weaving. Without wool, no warmth. Amo leads you down a muddy path, past a garden gone dormant in winter, to a paddock on the edge of the monastery lands. The flock is small, hardy, and loud. Their wool is thick and coarse, exactly what the abbey needs. These sheep aren't here by accident. Monasteries like this one often kept hundreds, sometimes thousands, especially in England and northern France. Some abbeys even leased entire hillsides just to graze more flocks. Because while monasteries didn't operate for profit in the modern sense, they were keenly aware of value. And wool was value, not just for warmth or clothing, not just for barter, but for diplomacy, for influence. Abbeys like Cluny, Fountains, and Clairvaux became wealthy not through conquest or tithes, but through wool. Their cloth traveled across Europe used by other monks, nobles, even bishops. Some was exported to Flanders, where it would be dyed, cut, and sold again at great profit. A single bolt of undyed English wool could become a fine overcoat in Bruges or a priest's vestment in Rome. But before any of that could happen, someone like Amo had to gather the raw fleece. You watch as he checks the sheep one by one, examining for burrs or signs of illness. There's a quiet intimacy in this. These aren't faceless animals, they have names, habits, moods. He whispers to one, shoos another gently from the hay. The fleece they carry is the beginning of the monastic calendar. Shearing comes in late spring, usually after Easter. It's a major event full of labor and ritual. The wool is not removed hastily. It is clipped with large iron shears, cleaned by hand, and sorted according to texture. Finer wool is reserved for altar cloths or high-ranking garments. Coarser grades go into cloaks or bedding. Once shorn, the fleece must be cleaned. That's where the process becomes less poetic. The abbey's washing shed, tucked beyond. The herb garden smells unmistakably of ammonia. For centuries, stale human urine, often collected in large ceramic pots, was the most common degreasing agent for wool. It dissolved the lanolin and loosened dirt. No monk complained. It was just part of the rhythm. They called it lant. The wool was then rinsed, dried, and sent for carding, a tedious job involving wooden paddles lined with metal teeth. This fluffed the fibers, prepared them for spinning, and aligned the strands. Carding could be done by anyone, novices, lay servants, even elderly monks too frail for fieldwork. Then came spinning. You picture it now, a monk seated on a wooden bench, spindle turning slowly in his fingers. The fibers stretch, twist, tighten. The thread grows, inch by inch, like a whisper made visible. This is the part that fascinates you. Spinning was not just labor, it was liturgy. Some abbeys assigned specific psalms to different tasks. One psalm for washing, another for spinning, another still for weaving. Not required, but encouraged. A way to keep the mind from drifting and to remember that every thread, every inch, had spiritual weight. But cloth wasn't only about threads, it was also about color. Back inside, you find Brother Marius near the dye shed, stirring a large pot with a long paddle. The liquid inside is dark blue. Thick steam rises from it, tinged with the scent of vinegar and iron. This is woad dye, Europe's answer to indigo. Grown from a weedy plant, dried into cakes, and fermented in urine or lye, woad yielded a deep, dusty blue when applied correctly. Not vibrant like silk from the East, but subtle, earthy, noble. Beside him sits a basket of other materials: madder root for red, walnut husks for brown, lichen for yellow, and occasionally, if the abbey was lucky, cochineal beetles for crimson. Imported at great cost. Dyeing was chemistry before chemistry had a name. Temperature mattered. Timing mattered. Even the mineral content of the water could shift a color's outcome. And because monks were meticulous record keepers, some abbeys developed near proprietary recipes for their colors, formulas passed from elder to novice with reverence. But even with color, most cloth left the abbey undyed. Natural wool gray, Brown, off-white was practical, humble, and in many cases, preferred by the church still. Color had meaning. A bishop's blue cloak said something. A nun's unbleached veil said something else. Cloth wasn't just material, it was identity, which brings you to an unexpected realization. In a world without mass printing or digital records, cloth carried memory. You might not recall a monk's name, but you'd remember his robe. You might not read the abbey's accounts, but you'd recognize their signature weave. Even secular towns noticed. Merchants could often tell which abbey produced which cloth, just by touch or smell. Some abbeys became known for tight weaves, others for coarse durability. Their reputation rode on every stitch, and yes, mistakes mattered. A poorly woven bolt might be returned, rejected, or used only for cleaning, which is why quality control was essential. Some abbeys employed a final inspector, an older monk, often blind or nearly so, whose hands were so sensitive he could feel misaligned threads others missed. You wonder, how much trust must be placed in those fingers, and how much of the abbey's fate rode on the shoulders of those silent weavers. Because make no mistake, monastic cloth was not just internal. It was trade. It was diplomacy. It was survival. Monks didn't haggle, but abbots did. Every few months, a merchant would arrive at the abbey gate, mud on his boots, scroll in his pouch, ready to inspect the latest output. He might trade salt, ink, glass, even exotic spices. In return for cloth, some deals were written in Latin, others marked with seals and ribbons. All were recorded in the abbey's books neatly, carefully, with names of buyers and weights of cloth. Even here, in a place of silence, commerce whispered. It's a strange thing to consider now, standing among sheep and dyed wool, that Europe's spiritual centers were also commercial machines, that beneath the vow of poverty lay networks of trade, labor, and production more organized than many cities of the time. But maybe it's not so strange, because to survive, even monks had to participate in the world they had chosen to leave behind. And what better way to do so than through fabric? Quiet, humble, practical, patient. You find yourself watching Brother Marius again. He dips a length of linen into the woad bath, lifts it, dips it again, each movement timed, each color earned. The cloth drips, steam rises, the blue deepens, and you wonder, what abbey survived a famine because of that color? What war was cooled? What bride clothed? What scroll wrapped in fabric made in a place like this? And what became of the monks whose lives were measured in yards of wool, not years? Evening returns to the monastery. The sun lowers behind the tree line, casting long shadows across the cloister walk. Vespers has been sung. The loom room is dark again, its rhythm quieted. But the work of cloth continues, not with tools now, but in memory. You're in the scriptorium normally, reserved for copying holy texts, but tonight, one of the younger monks, Brother Theodoric, is doing something different. He's not writing scripture. He's sketching a diagram of a loom. The drawing is careful, almost reverent. The lines show how the warp threads are stretched and how the heddles raise and lower them. His notation includes Latin terms litium, subtmen, tellarium. It's not just art, it's record keeping, because even here, in a place of prayer, the details of weaving are considered holy knowledge. These sketches won't be bound into a grand manuscript. They'll be folded, stored in the abbey archive, perhaps passed on to another monastery or a noble patron curious about textile production. Monks were not only makers of cloth, but curators of its craft. And in doing so, they preserved more than fabric. They preserved technique, tradition, and timing, the details that history too often forgets. You sit in silence beside Brother Theodoric as he continues his sketching. He dips his quill in ink made from crushed oak galls and iron, salts another recipe handed down through generations. Outside, you hear a bell toll once, marking the final hour before the monks retire. It's easy to forget, surrounded by cloisters and chants, that some of the world's oldest surviving fabrics come not from royal courts, but from places like this, from abbeys tucked in hills, where the rhythm of life was spun into thread. Monastic textiles had reach. Some were traded to Venice, where merchants sold them alongside Eastern silks. Others made their way to the Crusader states, stitched into the linings of mail armor. Still others were gifted as dowries or torn into bandages. For plague victims, monastic cloth-clothed pilgrims, warmed foundlings, and draped altars, it padded. Reliquaries, it wrapped bones. It was torn into strips and tied around wrists in times of illness or fear, simple cloth as talisman. In this way, monks who never left their walls touched faraway lives. And for those who stayed within, who spun, who dyed, who wove and mended, the act itself became a kind of memory-keeping, not dramatic, not grand, but patient and lasting. It's worth remembering that few monks left their names behind. Most are unknown to history. No fresco bears Brother Gaudier's likeness. No poem sings the virtues of Brother Marius's dye bath. But they left behind bolts of cloth, textiles so durable that fragments survive to this day in earthen graves, behind altars, in the lining of old prayer books, threads still intact, weaves still discernible. The irony is gentle, almost poetic, that these men, who vowed to detach from the world, wove themselves into its very fabric. Literally. And their influence didn't end with the Middle Ages. When Europe began to industrialize in the 18th century, many innovations in spinning and weaving machinery were drawn, sometimes directly, sometimes unconsciously, from monastic practices. The organization of labor, the system of apprenticeships, the use of accounting ledgers for cloth output all found echoes in early factories. Even in places where religion had long faded, the monastic model endured, work structured by time, silence respected, craft perfected through repetition. Back in the loom room, Brother Gaudier returns briefly to check the newly folded bolt of wool. He doesn't smile. Monks weren't given to displays, but there's a softness in his eyes. He runs a hand along the finished cloth, fingers searching for knots or unevenness. He finds none. He nods once to himself and places the fabric carefully into a wooden chest. This cloth might go to the abbey shop. It might be gifted to a visiting bishop. It might even be sent down river to a merchant waiting with spices and beeswax. In return, it doesn't matter. The work is done. And that, too, is part of the monastic mindset. The weaving is the purpose, not the praise. You walk slowly from the room, the scent of wool still in your clothes. The last light fades from the sky. Somewhere above, the stars are beginning to flicker. Below, in this abbey tucked against forest and field, a new bolt of cloth is being dreamed already, its warp threads measured in the mind. It's weft waiting for daylight. You begin to understand something deeper now, that this cloth is more than warmth. It is continuity in a world shaped by war, hunger, and change. Monastic weaving was a constant hum in the background, boring, yes, but dependable. And perhaps that's the lesson the monks left behind, that patience itself is a legacy, and that quiet labor, done without recognition, might wrap itself around someone 1,000 miles away. So you ask yourself, what quiet craft are we preserving now, without knowing, that might outlast us? Story 3. Quiet corners. The daily chores of an Edo-Era Japanese clerk wood under your feet is polished from 1,000 slippers, soft-grained hinoki cypress, smoothed by time and weather. It creaks in the way only lived-in floorboards do. You're in Edo, Japan. The year is 1817. The city is calm, structured, slow. A world of paper, ledgers, silence, and duty. You are inside the district office of a small ward in the northern part of the city. This is not a palace or a shogunate ministry. It's a modest building, plain roof, plain walls, plain lives, and yet everything here is meticulously maintained. The inkstones are scrubbed. The brushes are aligned. The paper is stacked by size and purpose. This is the workplace of Sakamoto Genjiro, a mid-ranking town clerk. Not a samurai, not a merchant, not a scholar, something quieter. Genjiro works and records, and that means he lives in a world where nothing is loud and everything matters. You see him now. He wears a light cotton kimono, patched neatly at the elbows. His sandals are off at the door, of course. His hair is tied back, not elaborately, but according to local regulation. He's already seated on a cushion behind a low desk, brush in hand, brow furrowed. It's early, just after sunrise, but he's been here since before dawn. He always is. His task, recopying family registries from the spring tax rolls, not because they're wrong, but because the old ones have faded. Paper yellows, ink runs, names blur, and in Edo, especially under the Tokugawa shogunate, names were everything. Where you lived, who you married, what rice you owed, all depended on these written lines. The inkstone at his side has been carefully wetted. The black ink is rich, oily, smelling faintly of soot and pine resin. His brush glides across the page with a rhythm that is neither rushed nor slow. A lifetime of repetition has made his strokes deliberate, weighty. Each kanji holds form. Each stroke breathes. Junjiro doesn't speak while he works. No one does. The office is silent except for the soft brush against paper, the creak of floorboards as other clerks shift, the occasional flick of a sleeve. And this silence, it isn't oppressive. It's expected. It's part of the rhythm of Edo life. Especially for clerks, words are for outside. Inside, you communicate with bows, glances, sighs. When he needs more paper, Junjiro simply stands, waits, and is handed it. You might ask yourself, how does someone choose such a life? But in Junjiro's case, it wasn't a choice. His father was a low-ranking official. His grandfather was a post clerk in Sendai. His older brother became a merchant and moved away. Junjiro was the one with a neat hand, a quiet temperament, and no talent for selling fish or steel. So, he became what his family needed: reliable. Reliable meant staying. Reliable meant showing up before the door opened. Reliable meant remembering that on the 3rd month of last year, the Kawamoto family added a second son, registered 2 weeks late, but accounted for nonetheless. In a way, Junjiro is a human database, but unlike modern records, he cannot search by keyword. He remembers by association. The shape of a name, the smell of the ink, the way a woman held her child when reporting a death. Memory guided by minor, mundane detail. At noon, a bell chimes soft and distant from the nearby temple. Junjiro sets down his brush and stretches his shoulders. Outside, lunch vendors have begun their rounds. He steps into the narrow alley behind the office and unwraps a small furoshiki cloth. Inside, plain rice, pickled plum, and pieces of grilled radish. Nothing luxurious, nothing wasted. He eats alone, as he prefers it. The alley smells of cedar, damp earth, and the faint trace of soy from a nearby food stall. A cat tiptoes past, ignoring him completely. After lunch, he returns to his records, but not to the registry. Now it's tax ledgers. He checks figures, small numbers, modest incomes, 1 or 2 koku of rice per household, sometimes less. He draws tiny characters in the margins, notes about crop failures, water damage, one mention of a new well. His handwriting is crisp, straight, dependable. It's here that you begin to understand the shape of his world. Hundreds of families, all living within a narrow radius, their names cycling through his hands year after year. He sees their lives in line items: children born, parents died, roofs collapsed, rice stores stolen. But he is not indifferent. These aren't abstractions to him. They're part of his mental landscape. He may never speak to the Yamadas, but he remembers when they lost 3 relatives in the smallpox wave of 1805. He recalls that the Nakamura boy was almost not recorded at all, because his parents feared taxes. He remembers, quietly, everything, and yet, his is not a dramatic life. His shoes wear out slowly. His ink dries more often than it spills. His most notable injury is a callus on his thumb, where he presses the ledger shut. But it's this very rhythm, this quiet repetition, that makes his life meaningful and restful. In a way, he's not running. He's not chasing promotions or fleeing debts. He wakes, he copies, he remembers, and the city ticks forward. You glance around the room. The sliding screens have been opened a little to let in the afternoon light. You see the dust and the sunbeams, slow, floating, lazy. On the far shelf are stacked old account books, tied with linen string. Each one smells faintly of age and glue. Each one contains fragments of Edo life: births, trades, fires, thefts, deaths, but never drama. Just detail. As the afternoon wears down, Junjiro begins to sweep. He doesn't rush it. He moves the straw broom in slow arcs, gathering specks of paper, ink flakes, a forgotten sandal strap. The act is meditative. He finishes by tidying his desk, lining up the brush, smoothing the ink cloth, folding the ledger closed, before leaving. He bows gently toward the alcove where a small image of Jizr, guardian of lost souls and travelers, sits on a shelf. He isn't religious in the showy sense, but he honors the routine outside. The streets of Edo are growing dim. Lanterns are being lit. The scent of grilled eel and soy rises with the mist. Children run past, carrying bamboo hoops. A dog barks once, then forgets what it was barking at. Genjiro steps into the twilight with no fanfare. His day was not extraordinary, and yet everything he did will last recorded, stitched into paper, preserved in twine. You ask yourself, watching him disappear into the quiet street, in a world full of emperors and armies. Who remembers the clerk? Who recorded the tax on a barrel of millet? And yet, without him, how would we know the empire ever existed at all? The city is damp today. It rained through the night, a steady rhythm on tiled roofs and bamboo gutters. The paper walls of the record office still glisten faintly from the moisture. Shoes are left outside, as always, but this morning they sit atop stones to avoid the puddle gathering near the eaves. You find Genjiro seated on his mat once more, this time not with a brush in hand, but a cloth. He's carefully blotting one of the old ledgers. An accident, though not a dramatic one. A leak from the roof has left a faint watermark across the registry for the Nakahara family. Genjiro discovered it before ink bled or names vanished, but it still bothers him. He does not show frustration. That's not the way here. He simply dabs, straightens the page, folds a soft rice paper sheet over the damage, and sets a rock atop it. Temporary pressure, just enough to hold the past in place. It's moments like this that define his work, not grand decisions or policy, not power, but repair, preservation, the slow act of remembering a society through its scribbles. Outside, the canal has flooded, just a little, nothing dangerous, just a trickle down the alley. The rain will bring complaints, of course. Water means rot, and rot means repairs, and repairs mean taxes, which of course means Genjiro will soon have more forms to copy, requests to file, names to track. And he will do it. As always, you might wonder what drives him. Why does someone so quiet remain so consistent, so meticulous in Edo? Stability was law. The Tokugawa government prized control above all. It froze the classes: samurai, farmers, artisans, merchants, and within those categories, each person had a role, often inherited. Genjiro's was quiet memory. The joke, if you can call it that, was that clerks weren't allowed to forget. If a shop burned down 12 years ago, Genjiro was supposed to know who owned it. If a boy was adopted in 1795 and returned in 1802, Genjiro should have both names. He was not a priest or a judge, yet too many. He served as a kind of moral compass by remembering what everyone else wanted to forget. There's a file he's working on now that speaks to this. It's wrapped in worn blue cloth. Inside, the household. Record of the Hayakawa family, a merchant household. Quiet, paid on time, but lately, there have been whispers, a change in name, a child missing from this year's report. Genjiro opens the older volumes, compares the strokes of each character. Sure enough, one name was erased, faintly, a second son, once listed, now omitted. He does not rush to correct. He makes a note in a separate ledger, child previously listed. Name Hiroshi, not present in current record. Cause unspecified. That's all. No accusation, no judgment, just the facts, quiet truth. It is not uncommon. Children disappeared. Some died. Some were given away. Others removed for reasons left unspoken. In Genjiro's world, the facts are sacred, but silence is respected. He places the file back with care. Later, he visits the central archive, a large wooden room filled with labeled cubbies and scroll chests. He lights a lantern not with a match, but with flint and cotton. The glow is soft golden. Shadows flicker on the rice paper walls. Here, too, is ordered. Each drawer bears brush-written labels. Births, deaths, crop damages, flood tax adjustments, and a curious drawer, tucked at the bottom, labeled not with kanji, but a symbol, to vertical lines with a line through them. It means empty. Genjiro opens it anyway. Inside is a collection of notes to small, or too uncertain to record elsewhere. Scribbled names, incomplete entries, messages left behind by clerks long retired. These are the things that don't belong, the names that didn't fit, the people who slipped through forms and categories. He picks up one scrap, faded, barely legible. Woman, unknown. Helped dig canal in 1783, Ward 5, no date of death, no surname, no registry entry, and yet, someone remembered her. He puts the note back, respectfully. These are the forgotten files of the remembered city, the ministry of forgetting. He sometimes calls it in his head, because while Edo is filled with temples and taverns, bathhouses and brothels, it is also full of people no one writes about. Not samurai, not poets, just figures on paper. And someone has to carry their memory dot as evening approaches, the workday winds down. Genjiro's final task today is to repair a brush. The bristles have frayed, not ruined, but loose enough to ruin a ledger if left unfixed. He heats water, softens. Glue, removes the handle, resets the hairs. Again, the process is not dramatic, but it is precise. Everything in his life is precise. Before he leaves, he wraps the scrolls in a cotton cloth and places them in a courier box. They will be sent across town tomorrow, one to a carpenter's guild reporting a transfer of address, the other to a temple where a widow's donation must be acknowledged. He seals them with a tiny dab of paste and presses the office's stamp into the fold. No flourish, just a seal, a sign that something was remembered properly. Outside, the streets are dark now. Lanterns glow behind paper screens. The rain has stopped, leaving the ground slick and glistening. A boy runs past with a paper umbrella. You hear the distant pluck of a shamisen from a nearby home. Genjiro steps into his shoes. He bows toward the altar niche and closes the record room door. He will return tomorrow. The names will still be here. The ink will still need mixing. The city will continue to live, quietly, through his hands. And you wonder, when the great temples fall and the generals fade from memory, will anyone remember the men who spent 50 years recording names only to be forgotten themselves? Spring has arrived in Edo, though not loudly. The peach blossoms bloom in quiet corners between tiled roofs, behind garden walls. Beside the narrow canal, the air smells of damp earth and wood smoke. And in the record's office, where dust never sleeps, Genjiro is copying the census again. Each year, the census arrives from the town magistrate's central office, long scrolls written on tough, fibrous washi, listing household heads, family members, professions, and rice tax obligations. Genjiro's job is not to question them. It is to copy them clearly, neatly, in perfect brush form. This is the work that defines his life. He starts with Ward 3, line by line. Names like Sato, Kawaguchi, Yamada, familiar after so many seasons. Some entries haven't changed in decades. Others are marked with new additions: infants, apprentices, adopted nephews. Still others are reduced by one, the name crossed gently, replaced with the character for past. Genjiro reads them not as numbers, but as patterns. The Shoji family has gained a second son. The Hino household is missing their matriarch. The stonecutter's son has moved to Nagasaki. These shifts are silent dramas, played out not in streets, but in margins, and you begin to realize something odd. In this world of minimalism, no bright banners, no marble monuments. It is this, the brushstroke, the ledger, the registry, that preserves a life. Outside, the clerk's garden is beginning to green. A small pond reflects the sky. Birds flit from branch to branch. Genjiro does not tend to this garden, but he watches it daily. It is part of the rhythm, a seasonal marker when the camellias bloom. It is time to prepare the summer labor rolls. He pauses his writing for tea, thick, bitter, without ceremony. He takes it standing, eyes half closed, hands stained faintly with ink. The tea is for clarity, not pleasure. He sips, exhales, and returns to the desk. A new request has arrived, a dispute over property lines between the neighbors. Nothing dramatic. A shared wall, a fig tree. One claims it is theirs. The other insists it straddles the plot boundary. Genjiro pulls out records from 21 years ago. He finds the land transfer scroll handwritten by a predecessor long dead. and traces the boundary using a bamboo ruler. He does not mediate. He does not decide. He simply clarifies. A week later, a man will come into the office bowing and grateful. Another will leave still frowning, but neither will question the ledger. Because the ledger holds the city's memory, and in Edo, memory is stability. You see now that Genjiro is not just a recorder of lives. He is a curator of peace. His scrolls prevent argument. His quiet diligence is civic glue. But what about Genjiro's story? He has no children, no wife, no property beyond his clothes, his brushes, a narrow futon, and a single red lacquered box that contains his father's old writing kit. His meals are regular. His evenings are short. He owns no kimono worth noting. He has written his own name, perhaps 3,000 times, and yet it has never been written about. He is not alone in this. Edo was filled with people like him, clerks, ink makers, card haulers, scribes, each holding up the world in ways that don't survive in poems or portraits. Theirs was a legacy of repetition, of names recorded and re-recorded, of brushes dipped until their bristles curled and fell away. And Genjiro's brushes have begun to fail him lately. His wrist trembles slightly, only after long hours. Nothing drastic, but enough that his characters wobble at the edge. He's begun to shorten his days. He trains a younger man, now quiet, eager, respectful. The boy copies slowly, makes mistakes, apologizes. Genjiro never corrects harshly. He simply sets an example, calm, deliberate, careful. In a recent file, you see Genjiro's handwriting in the margin. Copy cleanly, but know the name behind the stroke. That's all he writes, but it reveals everything. He knows his time. In this office is ending. He doesn't say it aloud. It's not the Edo way, but the signs are there. He has begun to give away small items: a brush to the apprentice, a spare inkstone to the temple priest, a favorite pair of chopsticks to the tea seller's daughter who always bows a little lower. One morning, he arrives later than usual. He bows a little more deeply at the altar. He reviews the daily tasks, but does not sit to copy. Instead, he opens the lacquered box and removes a worn slip of paper, his own registry card. Folded, old, but clean. He rewrites it, brush in hand, fingers steady. He copies his name with more care than ever before. Sakamoto Genjiro. He adds his birth year, his status, his ward, and then, for the first time, he adds a note that no one asked for, copied for the final time. He folds it, places it in the recorded drawer, bows once to the room, and leaves. No grand departure, no announcement. The office continues, the names continue, but one brush has stopped, and yet his hand lingers. Months later, the boy he trained writes with better precision. He copies the family names with care. He uses the bamboo ruler exactly as Genjiro did. In his strokes, the memory remains, not loud, not praised, but lasting. Edo itself will not last forever. Fires will come, the shogunate will fall, railroads will rise, but somewhere, in the folds of an old ledger, Genjiro's name will sit surrounded by others, preserved not by fame, but by form. And one day, a modern historian might lift a page, tilt it into the light, and wonder, who was this man whose brush captured a whole city, yet left no story of his own? Perhaps now, you know, great. You're now 3 stories deep into the calm, curious world of boring history for sleep, where the unsung rhythms of the past gently unfold in quiet detail. If you're enjoying this immersive, slow-burning journey through forgotten routines, humble lives, and the poetry of paperwork,